But there is a problem there, and here is the absolute rule number one for a tragic love story. The lovers have to die. You can't have them get together and then live to old age. Now, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell. Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. In this episode, you're really going to enjoy this, we're taking a look at how the tragic love story came to be what we know it is today in literature and story. And we're doing this by comparing Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet with the movie Titanic. So without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? The prologue to Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet lays the key fixtures for a tragic love story which are unaltered through time. I'll just read the opening, okay? Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured, piteous overthrows doth with their death bury the parents' strife. So right here we have two central characteristics of the tragic love story. Insurmountable odds. The two families, both alike in dignity with a ancient grudge. So there's two houses which will not have anything to do with each other. They are implacable enemies. The other fixture is fate. So another power which is so beyond the individual human. Fate, when life decides to take its course, what can you do? You are but a cork in the ocean bobbing around. And that's where we get this beautiful phrase from Shakespeare, two star-crossed lovers. The star-crossed, it means their destiny is in the stars. Their stars won't align with one another, so they're doomed to fail. Now that is the fundamental basis or backdrop on which to build out the tragedy of two lovers. And in Romeo and Juliet we see it clearly, don't we? The two houses are the Montagues and the Capulet. Romeo is Montague, Juliet is Capulet. And loads of twists of fate happen, just bad timing, which leads to the death of the two lovers in the famous scene at the end where Juliet has took a poison which makes her look like she's dead, but she's going to wake up, and Romeo is next to her and thinks she is dead, so he stabs himself, and when she wakes up and sees he's dead, she kills herself. It was just moments between the two deaths, star-crossed lovers. So where do we find the two great houses in the film Titanic? And I'm talking about the one with Kate Winslet as Rose and Leonardo DiCaprio as Jack. Where do we find the two houses? Because Rose hasn't even got a father and Jack hasn't got any parents. So there's no two houses, is there? Well, the insurmountable odds are made by class division. Rose is from first class, high society. Jack is in steerage, third class. So low society, you know, he sleeps down where the rats are. This is an insurmountable wall of difference, particularly in the year 1912. You couldn't mix. But what's interesting about Romeo and Juliet is it says, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. So what Shakespeare's done in this, with Romeo and Juliet, he's trapped the play in one spot to take place. Now we could say, two great houses, both alike in dignity, on the Titanic, where we lay our scene. Jack, when he comes on board, suddenly a world where the high class and the low class could go about their lives without intersecting, on Titanic, well, the third class were allowed to come up to the decks, weren't they? So there was a chance of meeting. And so there we have the two great houses, this insurmountable class divide. What can overcome that? You can't use force. What quality is so transcendent that it can get beyond the massive class barriers of the day? Love. So this is elevating love, which you need an ennobled quality if you're going to get a tragedy. Secondly, star-crossed lovers. Well, you've probably seen the film. Jack and Rose clearly love each other, but so many things crisscross to intercept their love. And when we think about Titanic, now I know James Cameron, who made Titanic, his actual reason for making Titanic is he just wanted to go down and look at the real Titanic. So he got Hollywood to pay for it, and he said, I'll make a film. But it just so happens that this fits beautifully well with the structure that Shakespeare came up. Because fate, we know from the beginning of the film that the ship is going to sink. We know it. It's one of the most famous events in history. So when Jack gets on board the Titanic, and how, by the way, by winning a game of cards, fate. Rose is on there, and she's going to America against her will to be married to Cal. Fate. She doesn't want to be on there. So fate has brought them together, but fate also has stuck an iceberg partway along the Atlantic, and they are doomed to meet their demise. And when you consider that, do you see how this makes tragedy? We're going now through the film and through the play Romeo and Juliet to begin to see the two lovers demonstrate this love which is so magnificent, so consuming, so great and above everything else. But it's dominated by two forces which do not want it, two houses that do not want it to match and try and intervene. And when they can push against that, fate intervenes to put a spanner in the works, to make things colloquial. So now let's step along and think about how Shakespeare made Romeo and Juliet's love suddenly transcendent, because there was nothing special about the two teenagers. They weren't mighty politicians or kings and queens. They're just two teenagers. Nothing special about Jack and Rose. Jack's a pauper. Rose actually, her family, her and her mother, don't actually have any money. That's why she's being set up to marry Cal. So there's nothing special about them, but they have the chance meeting. Now, mimicking Romeo and Juliet, this doesn't have to be done in a film, by the way. When we're looking at matching Romeo and Juliet with the Titanic, the mistake most people make is they try and find a like for like on every single point. It's not how it's done. Otherwise, every film would be the same. It's the principles, the key pillars, which don't change, but the details around them can change infinitely. Now, it just so happens there is a scene in Titanic which is just like that of Romeo and Juliet, but it's very incidental. And that's when Jack catches sight of Rose, when she stood at the balcony, the rails, looking out to the ocean, and he sees her and he thinks she's beautiful. Doesn't say it, but you can tell it on his face. Romeo, he sees Juliet across the room at a masquerade party and he thinks she's beautiful. Then with Romeo, he can go up to Juliet and speak to her. Jack accidentally meets Rose dangling off the back of a boat, doesn't he? And they start to talk there. And he talks so easily and freely that it appeals to her. And she's suddenly touched by his genuineness. And then they're brought together at the meeting, the dinner, aren't they? And that's very similar to the party. And this is the only time you're going to find Jack and Rose with all of the others, with the upper class characters who are implacably at odds with the steerage characters. I'm particularly talking about Cal and Rose's mother in this. That's the only time you see them together, and that's a bit like Romeo and Juliet at the Capulet party, where Romeo is actually allowed in. Lord Capulet knows Romeo's there, but he allows him in. He's like, let there be no trouble, just for this evening. That's what you get with this meal on Titanic. But notice something that happens after this. That's very important to the elevating of the ideal of love. A true transcendental love that's not foolish, but something to be desired. In Romeo and Juliet, you will notice that Romeo and Juliet only ever talk without others around. All of their meetings, no one is in attendance with them. The families aren't able to impose a will upon them. They try and do it from a distance, but they never see Romeo and Juliet together. Even Mercutio, Romeo's best friend, doesn't actually know about Juliet at all. He thinks he's in love with another person. Now think of that in the Titanic. What happens after that meal that they have, the first class in the dining rooms with all the hoi polloi? Jack says, meet me by the clock, and then he takes her down into the bowels of the ship where they have the party. And then later you see them walking around on the deck together having a conversation. And later again you see them running away from Cal's detective and they're running through the boiler rooms of the ship. You see, what this does is, for the audience, it makes their love unique. It's sacred. It's theirs and theirs alone, untainted, untouched by others. And what this does, it allows us into a very intimate situation, bringing up this love. We get to root for them. We want them to come together. Now we are beginning to take their love seriously, especially as the odds are stacked against them. And we've got an eye on, oh no, the iceberg's coming. With the audience with Romeo and Juliet, the prologue had said they're going to die. But you're rooting for them not to. It's becoming a very serious affair. So what else is factored in to make this love more tragic? Again, to get a tragedy, you need to elevate a person to a very high level before they fall. That's what makes it tragic. The way Shakespeare does this in Romeo and Juliet, and I talk a lot more about this in my course on them, is he gives you different forms of love of other characters around Romeo and Juliet. Now, where the characters around them may think Romeo and Juliet are mad, or they would normally laugh at this kind of situation, what Shakespeare does is he makes us see that only Romeo and Juliet have got real love. The others have a pale imitation. So, for instance, you have Juliet's mother, Lady Capulet. She is married to a person who is much, much, much older than her. But she's married for position and for wealth. And that's what she wants Juliet to do. We have other characters who view being married as, especially if it's the man, to a younger girl, as, again, it's a status symbol. It makes them look good. Others view love as just for sex in Romeo and Juliet. Now take a look at the Titanic. Why is Rose getting married to Cal? Because her mother wants her. She says it's a good marriage. It will give you money. It will give you security. Isn't that Lady Capulet? That's Lady Capulet through and through. Then you've got a very incidental remark in the scene where they go to dinner together. And that's when Rose is explaining who's who amongst the rich. And she mentions Jacob Astor. And she says his wife is pregnant. She's only 18. Bit of a scandal. Well, that means she's a lot younger than this rich man who has got a darling bride on his arm who is young and good looking for his own elevation. Again, how do you take love? Cal's view of Rose is sort of a flower in his pocket rather than a woman to love. Everyone around them has a false idea of love. But Jack and Rose truly love one another because all external characteristics of life do not matter to their love. It's 100% pure. And the things that they do together, you know, that bit at the front of the Titanic, I'm flying, Jack, I'm flying. You know, this is this oneness with nature as well. And you see this in Romeo and Juliet, this constant reference to nature when talking about their love for each other, this higher heavenly ideal. So all the way through the story of Romeo and Juliet and Titanic, the love is being shown to be different, unique to everybody else. And that's ultimately highlighted when their love is consummated. So in Romeo and Juliet, they secretly get married, and then Romeo goes and spends the night with Juliet. In Titanic, it's not quite as romantic. They go in the back of a car, okay? And they're not married, but, you know, our day is a bit different towards sex and marriage. Do you see though, what that tells the audience is it's consummated. They are now one together and no one else knows. So the secrecy of it makes it precious, but also the bond, the unity of it is great. No one else in their love are truly united, but these two are. They are soulmates, heart to heart. Do you see how this is copying Romeo and Juliet? And this is what makes a tragedy. And now finally we move on to sort of the last two parts of making the tragic love story. You need the strident foe. Now in Romeo and Juliet, the strident foe is pretty much epitomised by Lord Capulet and Tybalt, which is Juliet's cousin. Now, you don't have all these characters in the Titanic, and neither do you need them necessarily. The reason you don't have all these characters is the film is ostensibly about Titanic, isn't it? With a love story on board. If you had the Mercutios and the Friar and Tybalt and all that going on, the film would have been 6 hours long, not 3. But what you do get is a condensing of the enmity, the active enmity against Romeo with Cal. Because Cal almost embodies Lord Capulet and Tybalt together. Tybalt has a particularly vengeful attitude towards Romeo, hates him because of where he comes from. Cal hates the idea of Rose even being friends with Jack because he comes from this different house, the poor. And he despises the poor and doesn't want anything tainting the girl who is set to marry him. So Tybalt cannot stand this. Cal cannot stand this, just like Tybalt cannot stand Romeo wanting to go out with Juliet. Lord Capulet, he is the paternal figure. Now, Rose doesn't have a father. So Cal, because his fiancée has took on that patriarchal head of the house, almost controlling element over Rose. And he is demanding that she does things his way, just like Lord Capulet demands Juliet, you will marry Paris, because he is wealthy and this is going to be good and X, Y, Z. And it's good for the fame of the family. Cal wants to marry Rose because it's good for him, good for his reputation. Do you see how that works? And of course, Tybalt wants to kill Romeo. I'm pretty sure Lord Capulet would as well if he was young enough. And what do we find Cal doing? He tries to kill Jack, even though he should be getting off the boat to save himself. He has to go back to shoot at Jack and kill them. He can't abide that love. And what that does is it elevates the love even more. It's a love under direct threat of death. And so it needs to be protected. Again, all elevating. Now let's move into the final bit. Fate. The Titanic hits the iceberg. So that sounds the death knell of the ship and the imminent prospect of Jack and Rose either losing their lives or being separated forever. But how did the two respond to it? They try to work around it. Their love for each other keeps making them come back and back. With Romeo and Juliet, there's Romeo racing off to the friar, trying to make plans to marry Juliet. And then he says, we've got to make a plan so that Juliet can get out of her house. And the friar says, well, we'll give her this special medicine which makes her look dead. And that's what he sort of sets up with Juliet. This is how you're going to get out. Romeo's banished and so doesn't know about this. And by the time they meet, there's a bit of confusion and they both end up killing each other, killing themselves, not each other. Had they survived and lived a long marriage, maybe they would have killed each other, but who knows? How does that happen in the Titanic? Well, there's the fate banishment of Jack when he's sent down and locked up in the brig. But Juliet comes and finds him, as in Rose. Jack wants to be self-sacrificing in his love, telling Rose to get on the ship, and even Cal says, you know, we've got another boat across the other side we'll escape on. And Jack goes along with it knowing full well that there's no other boat for him. But his love is so great that he would rather Rose live and that he die. He does everything in his power to save her. But her love's so great that as the boat starts going down, she jumps back onto Titanic because she can't leave him. So there's this Star-crossed lovers, they love so deeply, but their decisions ultimately leave them on the sinking ship. Now, had Rose gone down, maybe Jack would have found another life raft and got away, and then found Rose later. But there is a problem there, and here is the absolute rule number one for a tragic love story. The lovers have to die. You can't have them get together and then live to old age. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Rose lives to old age. We'll come to that in a minute. If the story went to the end and you see Jack and Rose at 80 years of age sitting in their dressing gowns watching, Gogglebox or something, TV, MasterChef, would that be the ultimate romantic love? No, the passion's gone. They become old and fusty and they've got children and the hair's falling out. For love to be tragic, it has to be eternal. It has to grab us here. And the only way to immortalise a great love that's been built up in Romeo and Juliet, that's been magnified against all other loves around it in the Titanic, is to cut it off in its prime. And that is why Jack had to die. Because otherwise they would have grown old together and it would have been a nice story. It would have been cosy. It wouldn't have been tragic. It wouldn't have got hold of the pathos within us and ripped out of us the yearning for such an intense love which can overcome the obstacles surrounding it and even fate itself. No, fate is greater than anyone, and in tragedies fate nearly always features and crushes the protagonists at some point, normally by their own greatness becomes their weakness. And it was for Rose and Jack. Their greatness was their love of each other. Romeo and Juliet, the passion they had for each other, it was so great it eventually killed them because they couldn't live without each other. So what about Rose? She grows old, right? So does that break this idea of the lovers having to die? Well, no, because the principle is they do die when Jack dies. Their love goes. Although Rose carries on her life and you see those pictures of her riding the roller coaster and riding a horse like a man, as they talked about on deck, she's living the life that Jack asked her to keep. Keep living, Rose. You'll grow old. You'll die an old lady in your bed. So while she does things in her life, she never ever forgets Jack. If you were to be told in the film that she had married someone else and she loved him far more than Jack ever was loved, it would destroy the mystique of their love. She lived because Jack asked her to. And also, it needed to happen so that we could be told the story. Otherwise, how would you know that story took place on Titanic unless someone lived to tell the story? But when does she die? She dies over the spot where Titanic sunk. And there's that symbolic bit where she drops in the jewel, the heart of the sea. She drops it in. When she did that, I thought, well, that's a waste, isn't it? It's a priceless diamond. But she drops it in symbolically to show that she never forgot him all her days. Her love for Jack was always her one and only love. And it had more value than anything else. Imagine she could have made millions out of selling that one diamond, but she kept it because she was going to die old in her bed, true to Jack's request, at the same spot where Jack died, and connected by this token which linked them together. Brilliant piece of actual screenwriting there. You could say it's a bit trite, but it still works, it still grabs us. And a couple of little things as well that you might spot about Romeo and Juliet and Titanic. Romeo, Juliet, R.J., Jack, Rose. The initials are inverted. This time the fella's got the J and the girl's got the R. So the same initials. The other thing is the speed and intensity of their love. Romeo and Juliet takes place over the course of a couple of days. Titanic also takes place over the course of a couple of days. Confining it to one spot, the Titanic or Verona, and making everything run so quickly in a short amount of time, it makes us breathless like love. it's intense. It's got the impact value, which always makes something more precious in our eyes. If you have something that goes on for 12 years, it begins to dull a bit, it becomes samey. So this intensity of being condensed in time and place also is something that Shakespeare brings in, and he does this in other plays as well. But this one in particular has such a great effect on us. But whenever you're dealing with love, if you want the love to sort of be magnified, squeeze it. Squeeze it in time and place. And that's something that you'll find in Titanic and Romeo and Juliet as well. So, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope this is giving you something to explain to your friends when you see them next, just to talk about the similarities. Do it, because it helps embed the ideas in your own mind when you repeat it. I think it's called graduated interval recall. It's how to remember things. And it will help you, once it's embedded, to appreciate more literature that you read and more stories and films that you watch, to see the structure of them. So let me know in the comments what you thought of this video. Are there any other similarities you've seen between Romeo and Juliet and the Titanic, or even other films? Has this opened your eyes to seeing the structure in lots of your favourite films? Remember, the structure is the same, but the details around it are not. It's a bit like houses. All houses follow a rough plan, whether it's a palace or a hut, but the details that make it make a huge amount of difference. So, how interesting was that anyway, that Shakespeare, the great observer, put all this together 500 years ago so well that the stories today still follow his model. And I hope, if anything, it encourages you to start looking at Shakespeare, because he is brilliant. And also, the words he uses, hands down, beat anything you'll see on a film like the Titanic. If you need help with Shakespeare, by the way, go onto my playlists, Shakespeare Explained, and you will have lots of videos there where I'll go line by line through various Shakespeare monologues to help you appreciate the full flavour of the words that he used and the emotions that he conjured up. Anyway, until the next time, I wish you joy in your reading.